Gu Jin. You are a dog of our Zhen family. The younger sister despised her arrogant face. You have enjoyed the blessings of the Zhen family for so many years, and now it's time to pay back. The younger brother's condescending gesture of charity. We don't have a daughter like you, and the Zhen family's face has been lost by you. The cold eyes of the biological parents seemed to be contaminated with dirt. Gu Jin, we didn't expect you to be such a person. The Lu family dare not want you to be such a vicious wife. This is the divorce agreement bookmarked. We will have nothing to do in the future. If you don't sign, we have a way to make you suffer in it. The ugly face of her husband's torn face. All of this was experienced by Gu Jin, who has entered middle age. Beijing Court. Gu Jin was convicted of murder, corruption, and sentenced to death. The embarrassed woman who was dragged to the execution ground by the executors, even if facing death, the grace and luxury all over her body could not be erased, she stood there like a dignified and arrogant Samum. The people around couldn't help but feel pity when they saw it. Everyone knew that the woman standing here was just a scapegoat, and a victim of the ending of the powerful fight. Gu Jin lifted her head slightly, and there were obvious fine lines spreading around the corner of her eyes. Even so, it couldn't hide her beautiful face when she was young. She looked at the endless blue sky, curled the corners of her lips lightly, and sneered with irony and disdain. Boom! A harsh sound rang, and his body fell to the ground. A complete and innocent life withered, came to an abrupt end, and the brilliant red blood blurred the world. Gu Jin's eyes were open to death, her eyes were unwilling, hatred, and tough and lonely hidden deep in her eyes. Until the pupils slowly spread, there was nothing inside, and everything was a foregone conclusion. Little bastard! Give us what you have. Little that my mother wants. You dare to bite me? See if I won't kill you. A harsh and rude voice rang in her ears, and Gu Jin's eyes grew heavy. Thinking of the hard work over the past 2 decades, her heart has been painful and full of regret. There are still obvious memories of the pain in the back of the head, and she never wants to experience that kind of taste again. The bang in the ear and the verbal abuse aroused Gu Jin's impatience. She opened her eyes slowly, and the scene in front of her was reflected in her fuzzy eyes. Hit him, hit this, bastard, let him bite me. Oh, hit! Hit! Gu Jin's eyes gradually became clearer, and he could clearly see the few and a half-old children in front of him, the little boy who was bullying the embarrassed little boy on the ground, and there were a few children clapping around him. This scene is so familiar, especially behind the children, buried deep in memory in the low mountain village, backed by the steep Qingluan mountain. Here. This is clearly Qingshan village where she has lived for more than 10 years. Gu Jin, who was regaining his consciousness, looked at all the surrounding eyes and the pupils tightened. She lowered her head to see the blue cloth material on her body, especially the patches on the pants. The stitches were not dense at first glance. It was produced by her hands. Ah. A painful sound rang back Gu Jin's thoughts. She looked up and saw the little boy who had been kicked and beaten by a few half-old children before standing up with his back to her. He also held a large stone in his hand, demonstrating against the half-old children who wanted to get close to him. One of the half-old children was holding his head with his hands, with bright red blood flowing out of his hands. P.S. Hua has opened a new book. The content of this book is purely overhead. There is no evidence for people and things. Please do not check in. Thank you for your support / Little bastard, wait. I'll go to my father and teach you. The eldest boy in the group of half-old children seemed to be frightened when he saw someone hurt and bleed. He gave a harsh word to the beaten boy and turned around and ran. Everyone in Qingshan village knows that if the little wolf cub in the village is aggressive, even adults will dare to hurt. But there were also a few children around who were unwilling, especially the one whose head was smashed. He stared at the little boy sullenly, "And Mingji, you are a stubborn dad. You dare to beat me, and I can't eat it." The name Mingji was called out, and Gu Jin trembled. It turned out to be him. Seeing that little lonely and thin figure, Gu Jin trembled all over. Without even the brain to think, she abruptly got up and rushed towards the beaten boy. But she didn't know that at the moment she was on the big rock at the entrance of Qingshan village. It was a boulder that could lie down on 4 or 5 adults. She ran down because of excitement. This action directly caused her to fall off. But thankfully the boulder is big but not high. Gu Jin just twisted his foot and quickly balanced his body. Her actions attracted the attention of the surrounding children, but the little boy who was being bullied with his back turned to her did not turn his head. He was still raising the stone in his hand and watching the surrounding children vigilantly. Gu Jin looked at his thin back, and ignoring the pain from his ankle, walked hard towards the opponent. Big and little are born together. Suddenly a child said such a sentence. He Zheng's familiar words. If Gu Jin was still in his teens, he would definitely go up and fight with the kid. At the moment, Gu Jin ignored it at all, dragging her injured foot behind Mingji. At this moment, whether it was a dream or a dream of Zhuangzhou, she just wanted to protect the little boy with his back to her. Just because after her death, she clearly saw in the state of her soul that the other party was the only one who collected her body for burial. Today's Mingji is still a child, not an elegant man in a wheelchair. In the previous life, after learning of her experience, the other party unscrupulously avenged her in a brutal way, defeating the Zhenlu family and even ruining the 2 highly anticipated second and third generations, leaving only the old, the weak, the sick, and the disabled are suffering. Sometimes death is not terrible, but terrible is endless torture. Little Zioan. Her voice has obvious vibrato. Mingji slowly turned his head back when he heard the voice behind him. After seeing that it was Gu Jin, his dirty and bruised little face showed a reluctant bitter smile. Sister Ajin heard the return of long-term memories in Gu Jin's ears, and she couldn't help but make her heart ache. The two were squeezed out in this village, only because Mingji's father died of illness, his mother ran away with others, and the only grandmother died. And her Gu Jin's mother was an educated youth who was sent to Qingshan village. She couldn't stand the pain and was pregnant. With a good appearance, she married the second child of the Gu family and gave birth to her daughter whose father is unknown. Within 2 years, after having the opportunity to return to the city, the woman left her behind, gave up her many years of marriage, slapped her fart and left. In this way, she became a big bastard. Later, Mingji's experience made him a little bastard. The two were strangers in the village. In fact, they are not very familiar with them. She thinks Mingji is too pitiful and occasionally throws him some food, but it is just easy. But it was these small favors that made Mingji remember for a lifetime. Looking at Mingji's swollen and dirty little face, Gu Jin stretched out a trembling hand and gently wiped the dirt around his eyes. Even if she was careful, she still touched the other side's wound. Hi! Mingji wanted to bark his teeth, but in front of him was the only sister Ajin who was good to him, and he endured the pain and pitifully. Gu Jin looked at his patients and took his hand away. Fool! I don't know if it is because the child in front of her is forbearing, or if the other party will take revenge for her in the future. Undeniably, her voice was full of pity. Her so close behavior and the pity in her words are very strange to Mingji's ears. Sister Ajin rarely talked to him in the past, and occasionally just gave him a stick and face, baked potatoes, carrots, and other food, so that he would not be starved to death. Now that the other party is so gentle, little Mingji is a little flattered. Oh, a pair of little bastard. Little Kate and Dai. Big has no father or mother. The children around suddenly quarreled. Hearing these unbearable words, Mingji stared at them with red eyes and gloomily, especially at the child who was making the most noise. He raised the big stone in his hand and rushed towards each other. He was like a wolf cub, rushing away desperately. However, just after he ran 2 steps, he was pulled from behind. He turned his head angrily, and faced Gu Jin's smiling and gentle eyes. Do you want to bite it back when the dog bites you? Isn't it dirty? Hearing this in Mingji's ears, he didn't quite understand what it meant, and there was a confused look in his eyes. Gu Jin squatted down, looking at the little wolf pup who had just reached her waist height, and pointed to the children in the old patched clothes around him. Saying word by word to the little wolf pups, "Look at them, do they bark like puppies?" Mingji understood something at once and nodded vigorously to Gu Jin. "So, if a dog bites you, is it possible to bite it back? How dirty! How can a human be compared with an animal?" Gu Jin sorted out the worn-out clothes on Mingji, and scanned his thin body into a peep of bone inside his clothes, covered with terrifying bruises. Seeing this, the light in her eyes couldn't help cooling down. Don't blame her for bullying the children. The harm these children caused her back then can't be compensated by such a few words. Especially the little wolf cub in front of him, his injuries are caused by the accumulation of time, all caused by the surrounding children. How can she face them friendly? She has never been a kind-hearted person who complains with virtue. Mingji understood, his eyes lit up and he nodded vigorously, "Yes. People can't care about animals. Such a good boy is really likable." Gu Jin stretched out his hand and touched his head, "Good boy." The children around also understood that Gu Jin was scolding them, and they immediately became unhappy. "Big bastard!" Just as one of the children was about to curse, Gu Jin looked back at him coldly, "Get out." Her good-looking face was cold, and her voice was filled with ice ball. It was not like the anger of the family to teach them, but a dangerous existence. Children have never seen Gu Jin like this before, and bullying her in the past was nothing more than bowing their heads. At this time, she was so shocked and fled everywhere. Seeing this scene, Mingji couldn't help showing an admiring look at Gu Jin, his eyes clear and wild. "P.S. If you find a typo, remember to take a screenshot to Huahua, thank you very much." There is a skirt number at the top of the book review. Mingji has been raising in the village for several years, and there is an indescribable wildness on his body. It is a danger like a wolf, so fierce that it can bite at any time. Gu Jin touched the little wolf cub's head affectionately, feeling deeply in his heart. She stood up slowly, looking at the surrounding environment with her eyes. At this moment, she was standing at the entrance of Qingshan village, and she could see Qingshan village at the foot of Qingluan mountain at a glance, and the residents of the village were also in full view. This is where she has lived for 18 years. After she left, this was the memory she didn't want to think of the most in her life. Here she suffered all the insults and scorn. It's just because although her surname is Gu, she is not the child of Gu's family, and she does not have Gu's blood. She is a child whose father is unknown and abandoned by her biological mother. But she obviously died. Why did she come back here? Gu Jin hung his head and stared at Mingji who was standing beside him. The little wolf cub was looking back at her obediently, awkward and clear, everything was very real. Gu Jin took a deep breath, and she raised her hand to pinch her arm forcefully. Hiss! At this time, the pain made her eyes glow. "Sister Ajin, why are you pinching yourself?" Seeing Gu Jin's movements, Mingji quickly stepped forward and pulled her hand away. "Ha ha ha!" Gu Jin smiled, and the water in his eyes turned into hot tears. It hurt so much that she was crying. This is not a dream. With tears in her eyes but a smile on her face, Gu Jin looked at Mingji and asked, "Xiaoan, tell me what year it is now." Mingji's little face with blue nose and swollen face was full of puzzlement, and frowned like a little adult. "Sister Ajin, you have a fever?" "It's May 1986. In 1986. It turned out to be 1986. Gu Jin's fingertips trembled slightly. She unexpectedly returned to the year she was 16, 2 years before the Zhen family picked her up and returned to the capital. She has not yet become for marriage at home. In her previous life, she was short-sighted, thinking that her biological parents would find her, and finally get out of her head and live a good life. But somehow he stepped into the tiger wolf's den. Her biological parents found her when she was 18 years old, and brought her back to her home, which is the Zhen family. The Zhen family was far-sighted, and they saw that the Chinese Congress supported entrepreneurs in business. It is a pity that they have the ability but have no backing. Through their interpersonal relationship, they are fond of a Yanai surnamed Lu, to show their sincerity to marry the two. The biological parents were reluctant to bear their little daughter, so they came to Qingshan village to find her Gu Jin. When she was 18 years old, she was picked up by the Zhen family because her dream was to get out of this depressed mountain village and to see the scenery outside. Coupled with the flicker of her biological parents, she would live the life of a master in Beijing, so she left Qingshan village without hesitation. She did have a good life for 2 years when she went to Beijing. At home, she learned all kinds of knowledge and cultivated everyone's dignified temperament. Even though she didn't learn well at that time, she also learned something. However, all the changes happened when she was 20 years old, which caught her off guard like a lamb being slaughtered. She was strongly married to the surname Liu, and she became abandoned by the family. In Liu's family, she has experienced more than 2 decades of mental torture. Her so-called husband is in a high position, but he is incapable of persevering and is a particularly abnormal existence. The other side raised a lot of women outside. As long as he was unhappy, he would go out and beat them, mentally and physically. As for her daughter-in-law of the Liu family, she suffered mental torture. She was born in the Zhen family after all. Even if it was a chess piece, her husband would not dare to touch her. That beast dared not touch her, this was her only blessing. Some individual women came to the door. Seeing those women take out pictures that make people sick, she is like bone gangrene, making people sick and nauseous. But they found the wrong person. She is a daughter-in-law of the Liu family, but she is just a decoration. It is a vase placed in the Liu family, and it is a proof of the cooperation between the Zhen family and the Liu family. In order to take her out to save face, the Liu family taught her how to dress up, all kinds of knowledge, even unpopular foreign languages, flower arrangement and all the activities that chase the frontier of fashion, she must understand. Renqian is a good wife from the Liu family's living room and the kitchen, while Renqian she is just the Liu family's nanny, a dispensable existence. In the end, Liu's family stood in the wrong team, and she was pushed out as an abandoned child. Everything was confused until she died. Sister Ajin, what's wrong with you? The arm was swayed, and an uneasy voice sounded. The regret and coldness in Gu Jin's eyes dissipated. She lowered her head to look at the little wolf cub who had just reached her waist, and slowly stretched out her hand to touch her head. Go home with me. An Mingji stared at the slender fingers that flashed in front of him. His eyes were bright and dark, and there was a complex expression in his eyes. It's a pity that he lowered his head. Gu Jin did not see all this. Soon he raised his head and showed a good smile at Gu Jin. Okay. Come back home? Where does he have a home? He didn't know if Gu Jin said he took her home, whether he pitied him or just mentioned it. But he knew that all this was short-lived. It's not that no one has ever mentioned taking him home, it's just about taking him home, or because he is seriously injured, let him stay for a few days and ignore him. So later someone said to take him home, he no longer had expectations, so that he would not be disappointed. It's no different from before. It's just that he hopes to stay with Ajin's sister for a few more days. Gu Jin led the little wolf cub in his hand, step by step towards the familiar and unfamiliar way home. Every step made her feel sad. The Gu family has grandpa, uncle, aunt, adoptive father, adoptive mother, third aunt, third uncle, cousin, and younger brother. The people in the Gu family treat her very well, and they are really much better than the Zhen family. At the very least, Gu's family, who has no blood relationship, really regards her as a person. She still remembers her previous life. The adoptive father in the army came to look for her after learning that she had returned to the capital, but she didn't even see him for some reason. At that time she was being coaxed around by her biological parents, and she knew how vicious they were. Later, when she married to Liu's family, her adoptive father showed up again and said that he could take her away. After the Liu family knew about it, they didn't let anyone go, and even suppressed the adoptive father's family. At that time, he had already gone to sea to do business, but lost everything because of her. Thinking of the people in the Gu family, Gu Jin felt a little comfort. In this life, she will never know what is good or bad. As the sun sets, Gu Jin leads An Mingji and stands in front of Gu's house. In the small courtyard lived grandpa, uncle, aunt, cousin, plus one her, Gu Jin. In the open door, grandpa was sitting in a recliner smoking a dry cigarette. The eldest mother walked to the kitchen with firewood, seeming to be cooking. The cousin was sweating as he chopped firewood on the side. The cousin kicked the stitched colorful sandbag shuttlecocks. The only uncle is missing in the small courtyard, and he must have been in the fields at this time. Gu Jin, you're back. When Gu Jiaja saw his mother enter the kitchen, he stopped working for a while and saw Gu Jin standing at the door. Hearing his cousin's voice, Gu Jin called out, "Brother Ji." She took An Mingji, who was a little disturbed in her hand, into the small courtyard. The old man sitting on the recliner narrowed his eyes and saw that she was leading the little wolf cub in the village. His muddy eyes took a deep look at Gu Jin, and then looked away. When my cousin Gu Minmin heard her brother's voice, she stopped kicking the shuttlecock. She stood there and looked at Gu Jin and An Mingji who entered the small courtyard. "Why did you bring him back?" The howl of the woman's loud voice rang, causing several people in the yard to frown slightly. This familiar voice has no one else except the big ant. Gu Jin looked back at the kitchen. Aunt Chen Hong pinched the waist of the barrel and stared at both Gu Jin and An Mingji with ugly eyes, especially the latter's gaze like a needle. An Mingji is very sensitive to people's emotions. Knowing that Gu's eldest mother is not welcome and defensive to him, he went to hide behind Gu Jin. At this moment, his body was in pain, and even his stomach was grunting with hunger. If he had encountered other people in the village with this attitude towards him in the past, he would have turned away long ago, but at this time he didn't want to let go of Sister Ajin's hand. Gu Jin took a deep breath, looked at the unkind-looking ant, and laughed out, "Auntie, Xiaoan was bullied by the children in the village, I will take him home to get medicine." When Chen Hong heard this, her face looked a lot better, but she looked at Gu Jin and An Mingji's face still not so good. Then she narrowed her eyes, "Send the person away after applying the medicine. We don't have any extra food for him." Gu Jin squeezed the uneasy wolf cub in his hand and smiled and said to the elder mother, "Xiaoan's injuries are quite serious. I want him to stay at home for 2 days." Upon hearing this, Chen Hong's face suddenly changed, her eyes rounded and staring at the little wolf pup behind Gu Jin, wishing to devour him alive. Ahem! Before Chen Hong had an attack, the old man coughed aloud. She glanced at the old man who didn't say anything from beginning to end, but coughed twice, curled his mouth and turned to the kitchen. But he muttered unhappily, "The food at home is almost gone, and I brought back a person who eats white rice, thinking that he is a living bodhisattva, and the mud bodhisattva will not be able to protect himself when crossing the river, so he also brought a small oil bottle to eat free food." Gu Jiaja and Gu Minmin on the side were accustomed to their mother's attitude. They didn't dare to speak out, they just stared curiously at An Mingji behind Gu Jin. Sitting on the recliner smoking a dry cigarette, the old man did not even look after Gu Jin and An Mingji. However, the 2 coughs he made recognized Gu Jin's proposal. In this family, all matters must be listened to the old man, as long as he has no objection, the big ant dare not speak out. Although Chen Hong did not approve in his heart, he could only complain. Gu Jin looked at the complexities in the eyes of the old man. When she was going back to the capital, the old man had also persuaded her, but it was a pity that she did not know good people and had a bad attitude. Thinking back to the various things in her previous life, her heart turned back and forth, only turning into sadness and guilt. Nothing has happened now, and she will never do anything like that again. Gu Jin took the little wolf cub in his hand and walked to the first one from the bottom on the right. This is her room. The room she lives in is the room ahead, and the cousin Gu Min Min lives. She and her cousin lived in the two lower rooms on the right, and the old man chose one of the two lower rooms on the left. The uncle and aunt lived in the house, and his cousin Gu Jiajia, each occupying a house. In the small courtyard, there are wealthy rooms for 6 people. Gu Jin took the child in her hand and walked into her room, pushed it onto the bed and sat down. Sit down for a while, I'll look for ointment. Seeing An Mingji nodded obediently, she turned around looking for black ointment. After more than 20 years of memory, she didn't know where the black ointment was placed. There is a red painted bed in the cabin with neat quilts on it, an old wardrobe standing in the corner, a big box, a small table, and 2 stools beside it. The decorations in the room are simple. But this is good for Qingshan village, at least she can live alone, and there are these simple furniture that belong to her. Found it. Gu Jin squeezed the round cloth and black ointment he found in his hand, and walked towards An Mingji who was sitting on the bed awkwardly. She said to the child, "Take off your clothes." An Mingji pursed his lips, and stripped off the tattered clothes on his body, revealing a thin body with a peepa bone, as well as the scars on his body that had been beaten over the years, which looked terrifying. Gu Jin squeezed the black plaster in his hand and scanned the terrible scars on the little wolf cub's body, his dark eyes dimmed. Being watched by her gaze, An Mingji lowered his head and trembled nervously. Gu Jin could see all this. She suppressed the anger on her body, knelt down and applied the black plaster to An Mingji's severely injured area. Well! The child couldn't help but make a sound when he encountered a severely injured place. Gu Jin heard the sound and lightened his hand movement. Glancing at the dirty and shabby clothes that An Mingji put aside, Gu Jin got up and walked to the closet. Find out what she wore in small clothes a few years ago. Xiaoan, these are my clothes for the first 2 years. They are all washed. You can put them on. An Mingji raised his head and looked at the clothes that were brought before him, all in whitewashed green clothes. He stretched out his dirty little hand, trying to take the clothes. Just when his hand was about to touch the clothes, he discovered that his hand was dirty, soiled with a faint blood stain, and quickly returned his hand. Seeing this scene, Gu Jin also knew that the child was afraid of getting his clothes dirty. She sighed slightly, put her clothes aside, turned around and picked up the enamel basin on the corner shelf and walked outside the house. An Mingji raised his head and saw only the back of Gu Jin leaving, his eyes reddened. Is this disgusted? He reached out and rubbed his sore eyes. I have long been used to it, there is nothing to be disappointed. An Mingji got up from the bed and picked up the dirty clothes that he had taken off. When he saw the clean clothes that were put aside, a flash of reluctance flashed in his eyes. After his father passed away, his mother ran away, and his grandma passed away, he never wore clean clothes. An Mingji blushed his eyes, gritted his teeth and moved his gaze away from the clean clothes, holding the dirty clothes in his hands and putting them on. Hey, don't wear the clothes if they are dirty. Wash and put on the clean clothes on the side. Holding the clean water from the well outside, Gu Jin walked into the house and saw that the child was wearing dirty clothes and quickly stopped him. An Mingji squeezed the clothes in his hands and looked back at Gu Jin who was approaching the room. After seeing the water in the enamel basin in the other hand, it suddenly became clear. It turned out that he was not rejected. Gu Jin walked to An Mingji and held him with one hand, and put the enamel basin on the shelf in one hand. Let's wash it first. After washing it, we wear clean clothes. An Mingji lowered his head and said in a low voice, okay. It is a sigh of relief. He felt that a heart went up and down, and his heartbeat accelerated. After Gu Jin washed An Mingji's hands, and wiped the blood-stained areas with a towel, he changed his clothes. Not to mention, her clothes 2 or 3 years ago are just right for An Mingji now. Looking at the other's facial features with blue nose and swollen face, this is a delicate and beautiful face, with the handsome outline of an adult in the future. Gu Jin suddenly asked, Xiaoan, how old are you? 13 years old. And Mingji squeezed the corner of his clothes, and answered nervously. Gu Jin widened his eyes. The child turned out to be only 3 years younger than her. But he looked as thin as a 7 or 8-year-old child. If she remembers correctly, the child who bullied An Mingji at the entrance of the village before, the older child she first saw, and the child who ran away with cruel words, was exactly the same age as An Mingji. That was the son of the second family of Lu Lao in Qingshan village, named Lu Daipen. The reason why I remember clearly was that the person was very impressed by her. Even if Lu Daipen is younger than her, he is like a bully in the village. He often mixes with a group of children who don't go to school, and stalks the dog. And this person did not bully her less. Lu Daipen was obviously as old as An Mingji, but they looked like they were 5 or 6 years old. Gu Jin looked at An Mingji's thin, obviously malnourished body with distress and pity on his face. Just then the grunt sounded. Gu Jin Shao pointed towards An Mingji's stomach, still making protests. When An Mingji made the sound, his face was red with his head down. Seeing him like this, Gu Jin stretched out his hand and touched his head. Wait here, I'll find some food. Turn around and leave after speaking. In the kitchen, Chen Hong was sitting on a small bench on the stove and burning the fire, complaining to the little daughter who came in to help. Last year's harvest was not good. This year's grain will be harvested at least 3 months later, and she also brought back the half-size child who eats for nothing. How much food is needed? The food at home is not enough for us. When Gu Jin approached the kitchen, she heard her elder mother complaining and grumbling inside. Without stopping, she walked directly into the kitchen. After seeing her figure, Chen Hong's complaints also stopped, and he tried his best and stopped speaking. Gu Jin smiled and said, Auntie, what is there to eat in the kitchen? Xiaoan is also the child. He almost passed out of hunger, and I knew he was hungry for several days. When Chen Hong heard her words, she came up with an anger. When she was about to say no to, she heard that she almost passed out from hunger, and her face changed a little. She curled her lips and stood up, and said to Gu Jin dissatisfied, Wait. Chen Hong walked to the cupboard in front of the kitchen, opened the curtain and took out a yellow-faced bun from the inside. He walked to Gu Jin and said with a painful expression, Here. Thank you, Auntie. Gu Jin took the yellow-faced bun and thanked him with a smile. The so-called not hitting the smiley person with his hand, Chen Hong couldn't help but feel a little complicated when looking at the pretty smiley face of her cheap niece. She sighed and said, Ziajin, don't blame your elder mother for speaking badly. There is really not much food at home. We have young and old at home. The harvest last year was not good and now we are catching up with the spring famine. The next few months have been tough. Although the child you brought back is pitiful, our family really can't support him. Your uncle said that he went to the fields, but he went up the mountain without telling the old man. It is Qingluan mountain at the back of the village. If the man in the village is forced to arrive, who wants to go to that dangerous place? Speaking of this, Chen Hong raised her eyes to look at Gu Jin's dark and indifferent eyes. She gritted her teeth and said, Last year, the Du family kid went hunting in the mountains. He was besieged by wild boars and was injured. He was carried home only a few days ago. Just go. Our family really hasn't eaten after this month. For the sake of the family, you should send the child away quickly, so don't let people rely on our family. After Chen Hong finished speaking, Gu Jin nodded gently, I see. After answering, she turned and left. Looking at her leaving back, Chen Hong frowned. She glanced at her daughter who was washing dry vegetables and asked, What does she mean? Did she agree or disagree? Gu Minmin washed the dried vegetables on her hands, ignored her mother, and asked me, How do I know? You girl, what to ask you, dumb. Chen Hong was angry without hearing her daughter's response. Gu Minmin stopped working, shook the water in his hand, turned and walked out of the kitchen. Chen Hong's eyes rounded. What are you going to do with your dead girl? You don't know what the cousin means. I'll ask her, and I will tell you when I've asked her clearly. Chen Hong was so speechless that she hated it and glared at her daughter. The mother and daughter confronted each other in the kitchen. After a long while, Chen Hong was still discouraged. Why don't you ask? Go to wash your dishes. Gu Minmin didn't pretend, and returned to her previous position, continuing to wash her wild vegetables. This girl is also stubborn. Here, Gu Jin took the yellow-faced bun to An Mingji, and looked at the other person eating the dry bun. She was thinking with her chin supported. She remembered that 2 years before she returned to the capital, the village seemed to have experienced a famine. That year all the food in northern China suffered, catching up with natural disasters, and raining for a whole month. After the rain, the immature grain was completely destroyed, and the harvest of that year was less than 10%, and even people could not support it. If she remembers well, it is this year. Thinking back to the words of the big ant, Gu Jin showed a solemn expression on her face. An Mingji would not send her away, but if she wanted to keep the other party, it would be difficult for her now. In this situation at home, there will never be a foreigner. Gu Jin raised his eyes and looked at the child who was sitting next to him biting on the yellow-faced bun and eating small bites. Even if it is to pay back the kindness of the previous life, she will not abandon An Mingji. Perceiving her gaze, An Mingji raised his head. He brought the half-eaten Huang Mian Momo in front of Gu Jin. Sister A Jin, do you want to eat it too? Gu Jin smiled and shook his head. I'm not hungry, you eat. She stood up, walked to the wooden table, and poured a glass of water. Touched the cup, it was still warm. She held the water glass in her hand and walked towards An Mingji who was sitting on the bed. Looking at the well-behaved child, she suddenly had an idea in her heart, the idea of keeping An Mingji by her side. Gu Jin brought the water glass to An Mingji. You wait for me in the house, I'll go out. Before the child reacted, Gu Jin turned around and left. An Mingji, who was alone in the house, took the yellow noodle bun to eat in one hand, and the water glass that Gu Jin handed him in the other, staring at the other person's leaving back. Until that figure disappeared from sight, An Mingji's seemingly clear eyes dimmed in an instant. The light in his eyes was dark, a mixture of pride and final stubbornness, and the gloom that did not belong to his age. Gu Jin, who had left, did not see An Mingji's fault. How did she know that An Mingji, who had long been abandoned and lived alone in the village, had experienced all kinds of white eyes, beatings and insults from the villagers? He was no longer the simple child before. Gu Jin, who walked out of the room, glanced at the courtyard, and the figure of the old man sitting on the reclining chair was gone. She looked at one of the closed doors of the lower room opposite, knowing that the old man had already returned to the house. If she wants to keep An Mingji, she needs to discuss with her father, get the consent of the other party, and go to the police station in the town to go through the formalities. She walked over and knocked gently on the old man's door. Boom! Come in. The old man's voice sounded from inside. Gu Jin pushed open the door and saw the old man lying on the kong. The old man's body is chilly, and there is a fire in the house, so that it will be better in winter. Zaijin, what can I do with grandpa? The old man never kissed Gu Jin, but he never treated her wrongly. Gu Jin approached the room, closed the door behind him, and walked towards the old man. Grandpa, I have something to discuss with you. The old man took a deep look at her, sat up from the kong, folded his legs, stretched out his hand to the side of the kong, and said, sit and say. Gu Jin walked up to the kong and sat down, looking at the wise eyes of the master who looked muddy but sage, lowered his eyes and said, Grandpa, I want to keep Xiao An. She didn't want to raise her eyes to meet each other, because she didn't want the elderly to see that she did not belong to the soul of this age. Did you think clearly? The old man's tone was mixed with disapproval. Gu Jin nodded, think about it, Xiaoan will spend time with me, I will raise him, as long as I have one bite to eat, he will share half of it. The old man snorted, can you afford it? When is it? You forgot why you can't go to school. Gu Jin frowned slightly, only then did he remember that it was May, when he should have gone to school. The reason why I don't go to school now is that I don't have food, and I can't distribute food on it, so both the teacher and the students have suspended classes. Recalling the long-term memories, but these have nothing to do with Yang and Mingji. Gu Jin looked up and looked at the old man in front of him, Grandpa, I think very clearly. I remember the classmates in the town said that as long as they are 18 years old, they can separate their accounts. I want to ask the village chief to report my age to 2 years older, separate the household separately, then move Xiaoan to my account, and divide my share of the ration to Xiaoan half. The old man made no sound, reached out his hand to pick up the cigarette stick on the side, and put on the tobacco to light it. The room was quickly spread by smoke, and neither grandmother and grandson sat down. The old man looked at Gu Jin's face and had to say that this girl's face was really good looking, and she didn't look like their family members. Everyone in the village knows that this child is not from their family. But after all, the Gu family had raised her for 16 years, so how could they also cultivate love? At this moment, the old man felt a little unhappy when she heard that she wanted to divide the households. Looking at the unhappy look of the old man, Gu Jin quickly understood something.